Welcome back. In the following videos, we will discuss horror in early modern Japanese literature, so let's just dive right in. I would like to start with another brief historical outline since this will give you some useful background for the developments discussed in the following parts. Early modern Japan saw the unification of Japan through Tokugawa Ieyasu and his victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, which led to the fairly peaceful Edo period. This period is named after the town Edo, where the Tokugawa shogunate was established in 1603. Although Kyoto was still the official capital, Edo pretty much became the center and unofficial new capital of Japan. Through various systems in place, the shogunate managed to exert great control over the whole country, which led to a long era of peace during which the merchant class became more and more wealthy, which in turn gave rise to new developments with regards to art, literature, etc., and caused cities to thrive with commerce. However, due to various factors such as, for instance, an increasing amount of foreign Christian missionaries that tried to gain political influence, the shogunate eventually decided on an act of national seclusion in the 1630s where Japan completely shut itself off from the rest of the world. This is also referred to as Sakoku, which basically means locked country. Thereafter, the only trade that was still conducted was with the Ainu people, China, Korea, the Netherlands, and the Ryukyu Kingdom. The trade with the Chinese and the Dutch being the largest of these. This mostly peaceful and prosperous Edo period lasted over 200 years until Japan's seclusion and the rule of the shogunate came to an end in the 19th century. In 1867, at the end of this period, when the power returned to the imperial family, Edo Castle became the new imperial residence and Edo was given a new name, Tokyo, which actually consists of the kanji East and capital, thus meaning Eastern capital. Chapter 241. The Edo Period Kaidan Boom. At the beginning of the Edo period, printing began to gain traction, with publishing houses spreading throughout the country over the course of the following decades. Movable type printing had already been in some use since about a decade before the Edo period and would continue for a few more decades, but was eventually abandoned in favor of woodblock printing. The general spread of printing opened up all kinds of possibilities and meant a growth of the literate population. This era also saw the creation of so-called kanazoshi and other new forms of printed media. I'm mentioning kanazoshi in particular here because some of the upcoming examples will fall under this category. Kanazoshi were printed books that were written in kana or in a mixture of kana and kanji, making them more accessible to a wider audience. A quick explanation for those that are unfamiliar with these terms: kana are phonetic writing systems said to have evolved in the 9th century, where each character represents a syllable. There are two of them, hiragana and katakana. And kanji are the numerous Chinese characters that were adopted into Japanese a long time ago. In other words, since these kanazoshi mainly used kana, that made them more accessible because people didn't have to know countless complicated kanji so as to be able to read them. Now, it was also during this Edo period that the term kaidan emerged. This would become the term to refer to ghost stories and other strange tales for a long time. It is, in fact, still in use to this very day. There are, for instance, plenty of active YouTube channels dedicated to collecting and retelling both old and contemporary kaidan. Of course, as we have seen in the previous videos, it's not like strange tales hadn't already existed before the appearance of the term kaidan, but it was in the Edo period that people began to actually classify such stories as kaidan, began to collect them with unprecedented enthusiasm, and began to publish large amounts of kaidan anthologies. Possibly the first work to use this term was a collection of strange stories compiled in 1627 by Hayashi Razan. Hayashi Razan was a Confucian physician of the third shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. This compilation, basically a translation of various strange tales from China, was simply titled Kaidan and had originally been created by Hayashi Razan to distract Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu when he was sick. It was later printed as a kanazoshi called Kaidan Zensho. But what truly kicked off the Edo period kaidan boom might have been something else. A certain custom or game called Hyakumonogatari Kaidan Kai arose, where people would gather in the dark to tell 100 scary stories. This greatly contributed to the kaidan craze and fueled the need for more and more kaidan anthologies. A rough translation of the term Hyakumonogatari Kaidankai would be a kaidan meeting where 100 stories are told, and that was pretty much the whole point of it. People would meet at a late hour, light up 100 lamps or candles, and start telling stranger supernatural tales. And with each finished story, one light would be extinguished until after the 100th tale, when the final light was extinguished, it was believed that a spirit would appear. It is said that this started as a test of courage among samurai before the custom became more and more popular among the general public. Noriko Tiireda, in her book Tales of the Supernatural in Early Modern Japan, also explains these gatherings might originally have been inspired by the medieval belief that a miracle would occur if one were to tell 100 Buddhist tales in the span of 100 days. But no matter where this custom really came from and what inspired it, it definitely was a great success. Then, in the year 1677, a kaidan collection called Shokoku Hyakumonogatari, this could be translated as 100 Tales from Many Countries, was published. This work further contributed to the popularity of Hyakumonogatari Kaidankai gatherings and of kaidan collections in general. All in all, it was roughly from the 1660s and onwards that authors would publish more and more kaidan anthologies, which usually drew inspiration from Setsuwa stories, popular Chinese tales, or Japanese folklore. Now, with regards to point 1, there actually is an interesting work that could be called a kaidan anthology inspired by Setsuwa stories, or at least by something close to that. It's all a bit complicated and as such probably not the best and most representative example of point 1, but I'd still like to mention it because it is such an intriguing case. The work I'm talking about is a certain version of the so-called Inga Monogatari. The title could be translated as Tales of Cause and Effect or Tales of Karma. But why only a certain version of it? Let me explain. It all began with Suzuki Shosan, a samurai who had eventually become a Buddhist monk. As a monk, Shosan had gathered all kinds of allegedly true, strange, or supernatural tales from other people, writing down everything exactly as he was told without embellishing or altering it. However, it is believed that he had not actually meant for these texts to be published and instead had compiled them for himself so as to reuse their contents in Buddhist lectures, which means that they were kind of like a private Setsuwa collection, or at least a collection inspired by the nature of Setsuwa, which after all are allegedly true stories that often include Buddhist elements. However, after Shosan's death, a heavily altered version of these tales was published by some of Shosan's disciples, transformed into a kaidan anthology for entertainment purposes. This version was written in hiragana, one of the two kana systems, and accompanied by illustrations, and was probably published around 1660. In protest to this, a version written in katakana, the other kana system, actually followed in 1661, which contained the unaltered texts. It was published by those of Shosan's disciples who felt that the hiragana version was an affront to the accuracy with which Shosan had originally noted down these tales. Interestingly enough, though, it was the hiragana version that became immensely popular, the one that had turned Shosan's Setsuwa-like collection of tales intended for Buddhist lectures into a kaidan anthology for pure entertainment, which just goes to show once more how much kaidan were turning into a form of mainstream entertainment during the Edo period. A famous example of kaidan collections inspired by Chinese tales is Otogi Boko, which could be translated as hand puppets, a kana zoshi by Asahi Ryoi, published in 1666. Otogi Boko, or hand puppets, was one of various particularly influential works and was basically a sort of reimagination of several supernatural stories from China. Now, the reason I'm calling it reimagination is because Asahi Ryoi did not take the Chinese stories and simply translate them into Japanese word for word. Instead, he changed their entire setting to Japan, reworked the stories and characters accordingly, and turned the whole thing into a collection of 67 kaidan written in his own elegant style. One of the more famous sources that Asahi Ryoi used for Otogi Boko, or hand puppets, was the Chinese work Qiandang Xinhua. The Chinese title means New Tales While Trimming the Lamp's Wick, and it was written by Chinese novelist Xue You and published in 1378. maid. Apologies to everyone who speaks Chinese if that was pronounced incorrectly, but sadly I do not speak the language and had to rely on the internet to find and mimic the hopefully correct pronunciation. Now, possibly the most celebrated kaidan from Asahi Ryoi's hand puppets was the tale Botan Doro. The title means the peony lantern, which too was based on a story from the Chinese work New Tales while trimming the lamp's wick. With regards to this peony lantern story, the original Chinese tale took place hundreds of years ago at a Chinese lantern festival during Chinese New Year, but Asahi Ryoi's version changed the location to Kyoto at the time of the Obon festival in 1548, a festival where people honor the spirits of their departed family members and ancestors. Asahi Ryoi's version tells of a man in Kyoto called Ogiwara who has lost his wife and is consumed by grief. The Obon festival certainly doesn't help, since it causes him to dwell on the thought that his wife is now among these spirits of the deceased that are honored during this festival. He is so crestfallen that he refuses to go anywhere, rejects invitations from his friends, and stays all by himself, sometimes lingering at the gate of his home. One evening, night advances, the festivities die down, and the once bustling commotion gets replaced by silence as less and less people pass by his gate. On the dark, deserted road, Ogiwara suddenly sees a young maid approaching, carrying a lantern with a pattern of peony flowers on it, and an incredibly beautiful woman following the young maid. The beauty of this woman completely captivates Ogiwara with such intensity that he follows them and starts flirting with her. One thing leads to another, and the beautiful woman and Ogiwara end up at his house, where she vows to return to him every night if only he promises to always wait for her there. He agrees, and they finally undress and get intimate with each other. After this occurrence, the woman does indeed show up every night, and Ogiwara is so obsessed with her that he seems to lose interest in pretty much everything else besides his nightly meetings with her. This goes on for about 20 days, but Ogiwara has an old neighbor who by now has become fairly curious due to the fact that recently he's been hearing a female voice coming from Ogiwara's house. So one night this old man gets close to Ogiwara's house and takes a peek through the fence, only to see Ogiwara sitting in the lamplight, facing a terrifying skeleton from which the female voice emanates. The next day, the old man tells Ogiwara what he saw and warns him. Ogiwara is horrified and explains what he himself had experienced so far. Ogiwara then mentions that this mysterious woman told him she lived near the Manju Temple, a temple in eastern Kyoto. So the old man suggests that Ogiwara should go to the temple and check it out for himself. Ogiwara follows this advice and enters the temple grounds at dusk. This certainly is another uncanny setting, and it is pretty fitting for his ultimate discovery, because sure enough, Ogiwara soon finds a burial shrine there for a woman and her maid, as well as a peony lantern hung in front of it. This, he realizes in shock, must be the grave of the young maid and of the beautiful woman that has been visiting him every night. He flees the temple grounds in terror, only to realize something even more terrifying. This woman is going to come back tonight. He talks to his old neighbor once more, who advises Ogiwara to visit a certain monk. Ogiwara does so, and after explaining everything to the monk, Ogiwara is given a talisman that is supposed to ward off the spirit. 50 days pass without the woman/skeleton ever returning, and so Ogiwara visits the monk again to thank him for his help. The monk treats Ogiwara to some liquor and, well, things take a wrong turn from there. In his drunk stupor, Ogiwara somehow starts to yearn for the face of the woman that has come to his house for about 20 nights, even though he knows that she's already dead. Nonetheless, he goes to the Manju Temple hoping he could simply have a peek at her without being found out, only to be discovered immediately by the woman who reproaches him, then takes his hand and leads him into the darkness of the temple grounds, while Ogiwara's manservant flees the scene in terror. Ogiwara's body is found in the woman's grave, embracing her bones, and thereafter on dark, rainy nights, it is said that both the ghosts of Ogiwara and the woman, as well as that of the young maid with the lantern, can sometimes be seen together. It is also mentioned that the neighborhood was in fear of these three ghosts because those who actually encountered them on such a dark and rainy night would become terribly ill afterwards. It's not until Ogiwara's family prays for his soul that these apparitions disappear. As you can see, the entire story has been shifted to Japan using Japanese names, Japanese places, a Japanese festival, etc. And in the original Japanese text, Asai Ryoi even added some elegant references to 7th century and 13th century Japanese poetry, so this truly is more a reimagination of the story than a simple literal translation of the Chinese version. Such adaptations of foreign ghost stories were fairly common and of course had the added effect that their horror felt closer to the reader. I mean, think about it. Imagine you're a reader in Japan in the Edo period and you're susceptible to scary stories. In that case, which would be more frightening? Reading a scary story about something that happened long ago in a country far away from where you live, or reading about it happening not very long ago in your own country at a festival that you regularly visit? In that respect, altering the setting to create a story that feels physically closer and much more tangible to the reader was quite a clever choice. Another striking difference between Asai's adaptation and the Chinese original is that Asai removed the didactic Buddhist elements of the original, and this is actually a great example of the secularization of literature that could be witnessed during the Edo period. That is not to say, though, that Buddhist or otherwise religious literature disappeared altogether in the Edo period. In fact, a certain sort of early modern Japanese Buddhist literature will actually be of importance in one of the next videos. But still, overall, there was an ever-growing trend towards writing stories for the mere sake of entertainment. As for point 3, one example of kaidan inspired by Japanese folklore can be found in kaidan dealing with creatures from Japanese folklore, nowadays often called yokai. And what's particularly interesting is that while some famous yokai do go back to earlier ancient or medieval Japanese folklore, the Edo period also saw the invention of various new yokai, possibly born from the constant demand for original kaidan, which may have inspired a trend among authors to simply invent new yokai themselves to use in their next stories. Speaking of trends in early modern Japanese literature, there are two more literary genres that emerged during the Edo period that can also be connected to horror and the uncanny. One is that of the Shokoku Banashi. The term means something like tales from all over the country or stories from various provinces. These tales were compiled by traveling monks who journeyed across the country and gathered stories from all the places they visited. These Shokoku Banashi did not only contain kaidan, but kaidan or strange and weird tales were often part of them, so it seems fitting to mention them here. Two famous examples of this genre are Saikaku Shokoku Banashi from 1685, this can be translated as Saikaku's Country Tales, and Futokuro Suzuri from 1687. This can be translated as The Pocket Ink Stone. Both were written by Ihara Saikaku. The other genre is that of yomihon, a term that appears a bit silly when directly translated, as this pretty much just means reading book or book for reading. What else would you do with a book, huh? But okay, in all seriousness, it was probably called that way to emphasize the fact that these were works which focused on a lot of text and had little to no illustrations, as opposed to, for example, the earlier mentioned kanazoshi, which were easy to read and were always accompanied by illustrations. These yomihon emerged in the mid-18th century and were inspired by a certain genre of novels from China that were written in vernacular Chinese. Yomihon were actually rather challenging works, written for intellectuals, one could say, mixing historical and realistic elements with the supernatural and the uncanny. One of the most important works of this genre is the Ugetsu Monogatari. The title could be translated as Tales of Rain and Moon or Tales Under the Rain-Shrouded Moon. It's from 1776 and was written by Ueda Akinari. This work will be of some importance again in a much later video, but don't worry, I will remind you of this when the time comes. As for the whole Edo period kaidan boom in general, I would like to stress that this was certainly not a short-lived fad. Even over 200 years after the beginning of the Edo period, authors would still publish new kaidan anthologies to a readership that was as kaidan enthusiastic as ever. A good example of this is the work Mimibukuro, a huge collection of strange tales and kaidan compiled by Negishi Yasumori over the course of 30 years and published shortly before his death in 1815. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. In the next one, we will continue with early modern Japanese literature, and I will introduce to you one of the most significant and influential horror works of the Edo period, the influence of which can even be found in today's typical image of Japanese ghosts. Until then, take care and goodbye.